She spotted the Uziza plant. As she reached for it, grab, a strong hand seized her waist. Stella screamed as a masked figure pushed her down, his rough hands groping everywhere. She kicked and scratched, but he was too strong. He had his way into her, then. Crack! A loud branch snapped nearby. The attacker froze, then suddenly ran away, disappearing into the bush. Fams, before continue, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on the notification icon for notifications. Let's dive in. The morning sun rose over the small African village of Nkwo, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Birds chirped happily in the giant iroko trees, and the smell of burning firewood filled the air as women prepared breakfast. But in one small hut at the edge of the village, 12-year-old Stella sat quietly in a corner, trying to make herself invisible. "Stupid child," her Aunt Neka shouted, throwing a wooden spoon at her. "Why is the water not fetched yet? Must I do everything myself?" Stella jumped up quickly, her big brown eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry, Auntie. I'll go now." As she rushed out with the clay pot balanced on her head, she heard her aunt mutter, "Useless bastard child." Just like her good-for-nothing mother. Stella was used to these insults. She was born out of wedlock. Her mother had gotten pregnant for a traveling trader who disappeared before Stella was born. This made her family see her as a curse, a living reminder of their shame. But while her family hated her, the entire village adored Stella. She was the most beautiful girl anyone had ever seen, her skin like smooth chocolate, her eyes large and expressive, her smile brighter than the morning sun. Not only was she beautiful, but she was also intelligent and kind-hearted. "Stella, my daughter," Mama Ibeji, the oldest woman in the market, would call out whenever she passed. "Come taste my new batch of puff puff." The village children all wanted to play with her. The young men stole glances at her when they thought no one was looking. Even the village chief had once said, "This one is special. The gods have marked her." This only made her family hate her more. One evening, after Stella had been beaten again for showing off her beauty, her mother made an announcement that would change everything. "Pack your things," she said coldly. "You're going to live with your grandfather in Umuezi village tomorrow." Stella's heart pounded. She had never met her grandfather. All she knew was that he lived alone deep in the countryside. Was he kind? Would he love her? That night, as she packed her few belongings, her cousin Amora whispered, "Be careful with grandfather. They say strange things about him." "What things?" Stella asked, her hands trembling. But Amora just shook her head. "Just be careful." The next morning, an old man arrived to take her away. The moment Stella saw her grandfather, her skin prickled with unease. He was tall and wiry, with gray hair and yellowed teeth. His eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They moved over Stella's body in a way that made her want to cover herself. "My granddaughter," he said, his voice too loud, too eager. "You are even more beautiful than they told me." As they began the long walk to Umuezi village, Stella glanced back at the only home she'd ever known. The villagers waved sadly, their faces filled with pity. Mama Ibeji made a quick sign against evil. Stella didn't understand why everyone was acting so strangely. Grandfather's compound in Umuezi was isolated, surrounded by thick bushes with only 2 mud huts, one for sleeping, one for cooking. The first few days passed quietly. Grandfather seemed kind, giving Stella extra portions of food and letting her rest after chores. But then things began to change. One evening, as Stella cooked dinner over the fire, she felt eyes watching her. She turned to see grandfather staring at her body, his breathing heavy. When he noticed her looking, he quickly turned away. That night, as Stella lay on her sleeping mat, she heard soft footsteps approaching. Through barely open eyes, she saw grandfather standing over her, his hand outstretched as if to touch her. Just then, an owl hooted loudly outside, startling him, and he hurried away. Stella's heart raced. What was happening? The next morning, grandfather acted as if nothing had happened. "Stella, my child," he said sweetly. Today I will teach you how to make special palm wine. As they worked, his hands kept accidentally brushing against hers. His breath smelled sour as he leaned too close. Stella's skin crawled, but she said nothing. Where would she go if she angered him? That afternoon, the village priestess, Mama Agwu, visited unexpectedly. The old woman's piercing eyes studied Stella intently, then turned to grandfather. I had a dream about this child, Mama Agwu said meaningfully. The gods are watching. Grandfather's smile looked forced. There's nothing to watch, old woman. She's just my granddaughter. After Mama Agwu left, grandfather was quiet for hours, his eyes dark with thoughts Stella couldn't guess. That night, Stella was awakened by a strange sound, scratching at her door. Before she could react, the door creaked open slightly, and a hand slid through, groping blindly in the dark. Stella bit her lip to stop from screaming, tears streaming down her face as she pressed herself against the far wall. Just as suddenly as it appeared, the hand withdrew. Heavy footsteps retreated. Stella didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, grandfather announced, "Today we're going to the stream to wash clothes." Stella's blood turned cold. The stream was isolated, surrounded by tall grasses. But refusing would anger him. As they walked, grandfather kept finding excuses to touch her, adjusting her wrapper, fixing her hair. At the stream, as Stella bent to wash clothes, she felt grandfather move behind her. Suddenly, a loud voice called out. It was Mama Agwu's daughter coming to fetch water. Grandfather immediately pretended to be washing his own clothes, his face twisted in frustration. That night, Stella cried silently into her mat. She was trapped, with no one to tell. Who would believe a child over a respected elder? The evening air was thick with the smell of burning wood and cooked beans. Stella sat by the fire, stirring the pot of soup for dinner. Her grandfather sat across from her, his eyes following her every move. "Stella," he said suddenly, his voice too sweet. "Go and fetch more firewood from the back of the compound. The dry wood there burns best." Stella's hands froze. The back of the compound was the darkest part, surrounded by thick bushes. She had never been sent there alone at night before. "But, grandfather," she said carefully, "it's getting dark. Can't I go in the morning?" His face darkened. "Do you want us to eat cold food? Go now." Stella's heart pounded as she stood up. She glanced at the villagers passing by on the main path, wishing one of them would call her. But no one did. Slowly, she walked toward the back of the compound. The tall grasses whispered as she pushed through them. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making everything darker. As she bent to pick up the first piece of wood, a hand grabbed her wrist. Stella gasped and turned to see her grandfather standing there, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. His grip was tight, his breathing heavy. "Grandfather, you scared me," Stella whispered, trying to pull away. He licked his lips. "You're such a helpful girl," he said, his other hand reaching for her waist. Stella's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth to scream. Bah! A loud bleating sound made them both jump. A goat from the neighbor's compound had wandered in, chewing on the dry grass nearby. Grandfather let go of Stella instantly, his face twisting in anger. "Stupid animal," he muttered. Stella didn't wait. She grabbed a few pieces of wood and ran back to the main hut, her legs shaking. That night, she barely slept, listening for footsteps outside her door. 3 nights later, grandfather called Stella just as the sun disappeared. "Stella, take this basket of kola nuts to Mima Nkechi's house. She needs them for tomorrow's ceremony." Stella's throat went dry. Mima Nkechi lived on the other side of the village. The path led through a lonely stretch of bush with no houses nearby. "But it's night," Stella said, her voice small. Grandfather's eyes narrowed. "Are you disobeying me?" Stella quickly shook her head. She took the basket, her mind racing. As she stepped outside, an idea came to her. She grabbed the lantern hanging by the door and began singing loudly. "The moon shines bright. The stars are out. I walk with no fear, no doubt." Her voice carried through the silent village. Doors creaked open as curious villagers peeked out to see who was singing so late. "Stella, is that you?" called Mama Ibeji from her hut. "Yes, Mama. Just taking something to Mama and Kechi," Stella replied cheerfully, still singing. Grandfather's plan was ruined. The whole village was now awake, watching her walk safely down the path. When she returned, Grandfather was sitting stiffly by the fire, his face like a storm. "You took too long," he snapped. Stella said nothing, but inside, she smiled. She had outsmarted him this time. A week passed, and Grandfather grew more impatient. One night, as Stella was about to sleep, she heard loud banging on her door. "Stella, open up. There's a giant rat in your room," Grandfather shouted. Stella sat up, her heart hammering. She had seen no rat. "Let me in. I'll kill it for you." Grandfather's voice was urgent, but Stella wasn't fooled. She stayed silent, pressing herself against the wall. The banging grew louder. "Stella, do you hear me? Open this door." Stella's hands trembled as she quietly slid the wooden bolt across her door, locking it. Silence. Then, thud. Grandfather had kicked the door. "Stupid girl," he hissed from outside. Stella didn't move. She waited until his footsteps faded away. The next morning, Grandfather acted as if nothing had happened. But Stella wasn't taking any more chances. That night, she didn't even go to her room. Instead, she spread her mat outside in the open compound where everyone could see her. When Grandfather saw her there, his face turned red with anger. But he couldn't do anything, not with the neighbors watching. Grandfather was getting desperate. One evening, he handed Stella a steaming cup of tea. "Drink this, my child. It will help you sleep well." Stella stared at the dark liquid. The smell was strange, bitter, not like the usual tea. "Thank you, Grandfather," she said sweetly. She lifted the cup to her lips, but didn't drink. Instead, she pretended to sip, then set it down. "You must drink it all," Grandfather insisted, his eyes watching her closely. Stella nodded. When he turned away for a second, she quickly poured the tea into the dirt. That night, she lay on her mat, pretending to be asleep. Sure enough, after some time, her door creaked open. Heavy footsteps entered. Stella held her breath, her body stiff with fear. A hand touched her shoulder. Then suddenly, Grandfather cursed under his breath. Still awake? He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Stella let out a shaky breath. She had escaped again. Grandfather was furious. His plans had failed 4 times. But he wasn't giving up. As Stella slept outside under the moonlight, she didn't see the shadowy figure standing over her, watching. Grandfather smiled to himself. "This time, I won't fail." One morning, Grandfather groaned dramatically. "Stella, I'm very sick. Only the Uziza asterisk leaf from the middle of the bush can cure me." Stella's hands trembled. The deep bush was scary, full of snakes, scorpions, and worse. But Grandfather looked so pale. I'll go," she whispered. As Stella entered the dark bush, Grandfather sneaked out through a hidden path, a face mask covering his features. His plan was simple: ambush her where no one could see or hear, then escape before she recognized him. The deeper Stella went, the louder her heart pounded. Thorny vines scratched her legs. Strange sounds came from the shadows. Finally, she spotted the Uziza plant. As she reached for it, grab! A strong hand seized her waist. Stella screamed as a masked figure pushed her down, his rough hands groping everywhere. She kicked and scratched, but he was too strong. He had his way into her, then. Crack! A loud branch snapped nearby. The attacker froze, then suddenly ran away, disappearing into the bush. Trembling and sobbing, Stella grabbed the leaf and ran home. There, Grandfather lay groaning on his bed, looking weak. "Did you get it?" he asked hoarsely. Stella nodded, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to tell him what happened, but he seemed too sick to hear such news. That night, as she washed her torn clothes, she noticed something. Grandfather's shoes were muddy, like he'd been in the bush. And under his pillow was the edge of a face mask. Stella's blood turned to ice.